Would you like to step into the daily life of one of the most interesting civilizations in history? I think your answer is yes. Then let's begin. Throughout history, there have been few states that reached such vast borders as Rome, developed their own unique culture and system of governance over many long years, and had such a profound impact on humanity. Despite this, we do not know for certain how the state was founded. We can only make guesses based on legends. The most famous of these legends is the story of the brothers named Romulus and Remus. Come on, before we start with daily life in Rome, let's examine the founding legend of this magnificent state. The legend begins with the local king Numitor being overthrown by his brother Umulius. The deposed king Numitor has a daughter named Rhea Silva. Rhea Silva is not killed, but is sent to a temple, because in the temple, the penalty for giving birth is death. This way, no new heir to the throne would be born. However, according to belief, she is impregnated by the war god Ares. From this pregnancy, 2 children, Romulus and Remus, are born. Upon this, Amulius, the king who had seized the throne, has Silva executed by drowning her in the river, and places the children in baskets, leaving them in the river. The basket, carried by the current, gets caught in the branches of a fig tree after a while. Remus and Romulus are found and nursed by a she-wolf until a shepherd finds them. And this event becomes the subject of many statues in Rome. The twins, raised by the shepherd and his wife, grow into young, strong warriors. Learning their true identities, Remus and Romulus return to their birthplace. They kill the tyrannical king and return the throne to their grandfather, Numitor. Later, Remus and Romulus leave this place and decide to go to the spot where they were washed ashore in the basket and found a city there. As they begin to build the city, a fight breaks out between the 2 brothers over a simple disagreement. Romulus, succumbing to a moment of anger, kills his brother Remus and founds the city alone. The city founded by Romulus is named Rome. Factually, the founding date is accepted by the Romans as April 21, 753 before Christ. Actually, although we have no sources other than the legend, estimates also point to roughly this period. It is thought that the fratricide and leadership struggles experienced in this legend are a reflection of the internal turmoil experienced in all phases of Rome. So, what was the daily life of the Roman people like? Come on, let's now take an adventurous journey together to 2,000 years ago. The homes of the Romans. We can divide Roman houses into 2 types, the domus and the insula. The domus was the name given to a private residence in ancient Rome. They could range from small houses to structures that fit the definition of a palace. A single family lived in these residences. If these domus-style houses belonged to wealthy families, they were quite large and grand, and often contained ornate gardens within them. Since all 4 sides of these gardens were surrounded by walls or other rooms of the house, they could not be seen from the outside. They were adorned with columns, statues, various plants, and small fountains. In good weather, the household would spend a significant part of the day in these gardens. If the weather was nice, meals were eaten here. Daily meetings were held here, and the family would carry out all their activities in the garden instead of the other rooms of the house. These gardens, which were much more densely packed with plants and fountains compared to modern gardens, could be so filled with lush greenery as to be considered suffocating. And these gardens were called the hortus, Right now you are seeing an example of a hortus on the screen. Another important part of the house is the atrium. The atrium is a courtyard, usually with a pool in the middle, surrounded by other rooms. It is one of the most important parts of the house, where Romans would receive their guests and freedmen, and it was the central hub for daily business. Bedrooms, family living rooms, and kitchens opened onto the atrium. It was usually open to the sky and sometimes partially roofed. It had a calm atmosphere, away from the heat and noise of the outside world. The pool in the middle was both decorative and had an important function in collecting rainwater. If you were to enter the house of a wealthy person in the Roman period, you would see slaves rushing about on errands and the homeowners in the atrium section of the house all day long. The atrium, surrounded by columns and opening into many rooms, was an architecture that provided high-level benefits both aesthetically and in terms of comfort. It became a signature feature in the Roman period and was frequently used in many houses, temples, and palaces. In hot weather, this was the house's main activity area. There were grills, tables, and mirrors, and at the feasts organized by the homeowners, theater plays, various shows, dances, and sometimes even small gladiator fights were held here to entertain the guests. In this section, families with noble ancestors had masks made from plaster casts of their ancestors' faces. A noble family could have dozens of face masks. The masks were usually made by taking a plaster cast from the person's face after they died. Some nobles, at the feasts they organized in their homes, would place an oil lamp or a candle behind each mask to show off their prestige, creating a visual feast. At the events organized by the family in the atrium, sometimes slaves would engage in sexual intercourse with each other, creating a live pornography show. Although this was rare, it was not uncommon in Roman history. The oikos, on the other hand, appears as the banquet hall of the house. The oikos rooms, one of the most luxurious parts of the homes of the Roman rich, were ornate and spacious. The walls were decorated with frescoes, and columns added magnificence to the interior. However, one of the most significant disadvantages of Roman houses from a modern perspective was that the wall paintings and paints were generally done in dark colors. Despite being a hot Mediterranean city, wealthy Romans predominantly used dark paints in their homes, even the darkest shades of red. Yet one would expect the architecture in the Mediterranean to be adorned with lighter and airier colors. Indeed, the biggest disadvantage of dark color is that it absorbs light and reflects heat. We see the same wall painting style in the other rooms of the house, including the bedrooms, which were smaller compared to today's. Bedrooms were on average 4 to 5 square meters, and beds were made for single occupancy. In the homes of the wealthy, each family member had a separate bedroom. This was also true for spouses who only occasionally slept together. The sofas in Roman houses were not like modern sofas where you could lean back and sit comfortably. Even in the most luxurious homes, seating arrangements usually consisted of divans where a single person could lie down. For this reason, conversations and feasts were generally held not by sitting around a table, but by reclining on divans.
Various trays that they could easily reach while lying down during meals were placed on lower coffee tables. The toilets in Roman houses were called the latrina. Latrinas were usually adjacent to the kitchen, separated by a wall, and sometimes built in a corner of the kitchen. The bathroom, toilet, and kitchen were constructed as a single unit. The oil lamp next to the toilet provided light, and the dirty water collected inside the toilet was drained out of the house through waste pipes. The toilets, sometimes made of wood and sometimes of marble, had a large hole in the middle and were about half a meter high. The insulae. The places where mostly poor and destitute Roman families lived were similar to modern apartment buildings and were called insulae. The insulae, which could reach up to 9 stories, were built to reduce costs and to house Rome's growing population. There were insulae for the middle class, or, depending on your budget, for the lower class, and most of them were single-room apartments. There was no water, toilet, or kitchen. All needs were met in the single room of the house, or in 2 or 3 rooms if your finances were better. An average of 200 people lived in one insula, and they paid rent to the landlords. The Greek historian Plutarch recounts what the Roman senator Tiberius Gracchus said about the insulae as follows: "The beasts of the field and the birds of the air have their nests and places of shelter, but the men who fight and die for Italy have access only to the light of day and the air." Juvenal satirizes the insulae in a poem. "Look at the houses rising like towers, to the houses rising 10 stories, one on top of the other. These buildings were not only cold, airless, and overcrowded rooms lacking sanitary facilities and kitchens, but they were also poorly constructed from a technical standpoint." The poet Martial describes it elsewhere. "They swayed with every gust of wind." So the insulae were very unsafe places. The lower floors were used for shops and entertainment venues, that is, for tavern purposes, while the upper floors were built for accommodation. The Romans were the first civilization to build multi-story structures with the insula. Today, the remains of insulae are most commonly found in Rome and Ostia. In the insulae inhabited by the lowest class, as many as 40 people lived together in a 400-square-foot room. After frequent fires and collapses, Emperor Augustus restricted the height to 70 Roman feet, which is equivalent to 20 meters. After the Great Fire of Rome, the height was reduced to 60 Roman feet, or 17.5 meters, by Emperor Nero. The insulae are the structures that laid the foundation for modern apartment living, and due to their dense population, opened the door to epidemic diseases. Due to security problems and extra flights of stairs, the top floors of the insulae were the least desirable, and therefore the cheapest to rent. There was a communal toilet on the ground floor of the insulae, and besides that, there were pots used as chamber pots in the rooms or in the multi-room insulae homes. The rooms where the poorest lived were called calae, and it was not surprising to see many people crammed together in the same room. These sections were usually on the top floors, which were the hardest to access, and you might have to climb an average of 200 steps. Thanks to poor workmanship, foundations, and building materials, they were sometimes so flimsily constructed that bricks or wall materials frequently collapsed, killing passers-by. Lawyers of the time recorded it as a nightmare trying to determine who was legally responsible when a passerby was injured in an accident, the owner, the tenant, or the subtenant.
In this context, we encounter the figure of the insularius, the responsible caretaker of each insula, and the firefighter. Fire crews always had the right to enter to check if there was a problem inside. Some of the most famous Romans were slumlords. For example, the famous philosopher, orator, and politician Cicero derived a large part of his income from the rents of the insulae he owned. In a letter to his best friend Atticus, Cicero talks about converting an old bathhouse into small apartment units and encourages his friend to outbid everyone for the property he wants. We know that the extremely wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus supposedly waited for buildings to burn down. Perhaps he even burned his own insulae to build new ones and rent them out for high prices. It was possible to see a mother cooking on a grill in one corner of the room, a father resting after a long day's work in another corner, and a child playing with small gladiator toys. In the inner rooms of the insulae, there were no windows, and sunlight never entered during the day. Therefore, they were often lit with lamps. The lowest level insulae were temporary accommodations preferred mostly by bachelors. Romans with better budgets, especially if they were married, could move to mid-level insulae. In such places, which had slightly higher rents, 8 to 10 apartments would open onto a common courtyard. The homes could have 2 or 4 rooms. The common courtyard was both the entrance and the daily living area. All the women in the insula would cook their meals here, eat here, and conversations and daily activities would take place here. Laundry and sometimes even bathing needs were met in this common courtyard of the insula. So everyone living in an insula was a witness to each other's entire life in every aspect. In such mid-level insulae, there was a communal toilet in the courtyard. Women would help each other with daily chores. People spent most of their day in this courtyard, and children played their games here. We can interpret the life in these insulae consisting of 8 to 10 apartments opening onto a common courtyard as families living together in a large house. Tens of thousands of such apartment blocks were needed to house Rome's immense and fluctuating population. A list of the city's buildings shows that there were more than 44,000 insula, and if this is true, some of them, as we mentioned, must have been quite small. Clothing and attire. The tunic was a practical garment for every Roman. The tunic, frequently mentioned in the Roman period, is the basic form of clothing for Roman men and women. The length of the tunic worn was mid-calf for men, while for women of all statuses, it extended to the floor or to the ankles. In Etruscan times, the tunic, which was worn loose or sometimes with a belt, was more commonly worn with a belt in Rome, except during times of mourning, grief, or religious ceremonies. The tunic, which generally extended to below the knee in various seasons, was worn as a single piece, and sandals were worn on the feet. Everyone, whether slave or worker, wore a tunic. They slept and woke up in tunics. Workers' tunics were shorter to allow for easier movement, and in cold weather, they would wear 2 or 3 tunics on top of each other. From the notes of Roman historian Suetonius, it is understood that Emperor Augustus wore 4 layers of tunics, a heavy toga, a woolen chest protector, and an undergarment in winter, as well as a covering that wrapped his legs and thighs. It was possible to find tunics of different designs for every type of citizen.
Tunics extending to the ankles for women, ornate and wide. Sleeveless and short tunics for guards and soldiers. Ornate tunics for young girls. These were the types of clothing that would be encountered at any moment in daily life. The toga. The toga, the most characteristic garment of Rome, was an attire that indicated status belonging to the upper class. If you were walking the streets of Rome in a toga, it meant you possessed a power to be feared, and the punishment for a commoner wearing a toga was death. The toga is the most characteristic garment of ancient Rome, obtained by wrapping a sash approximately 6 meters long around the body in a specific manner, and it was usually worn over a tunic. The toga was invariably made of wool, and the tunic worn underneath was usually made of linen. Throughout Roman history, the toga was generally worn by men, while women preferred to wear the stola. The toga is the oldest known garment of the Romans. The toga, which was taken off when working indoors or in the fields, was only worn outside. We learn this from a story about Cincinnatus. One day, while he was working in the field, a messenger from the Senate came to inform him that he had been declared dictator by the Senate. The dictatorship was a respected and official position in Rome. Seeing the messenger approaching from a distance, Cincinnatus immediately sent his wife home to fetch his toga, and thus was able to receive the delegation appropriately. The truth of the story may be debatable, but it is still a good example of the Romans' sensitivity on the matter. The toga held a very popular place in Roman clothing. Over time, the style of the garment changed. The Romans adopted a type of shirt also worn by the Greeks and Etruscans, which gave the toga a more voluminous appearance and was worn in a slightly looser style. As a result, the toga became more impractical in situations requiring movement, such as battle. Thus, in all military activities, the toga's place was taken by the sagum, a type of woolen cloak. In times of peace, the toga was also replaced by types of cloaks like the laena, la serna, painula, and other buttoned or closed mantles. However, the toga maintained its existence as the dominant robe of the empire. Since the toga was not worn by soldiers, it was also considered a sign of peace. Civilians were sometimes referred to as togatus, meaning toga wearer, in contrast to the sagum worn by soldiers. The saying, cedant arma togae, found in Cicero's work De Officii, translates to let arms yield to the toga, meaning that peace should replace war, or military power should yield to civil authority. The palla. The palla was a long rectangular piece of cloth that Roman women used like a coat when outside the home. Just like women in the Near East today, women in ancient Rome did not leave their homes without being modestly covered with a wrap. Outside the home, a woman covered her body and possibly her head with the palla to protect herself from both the cold and any inappropriate display. Thus, she felt protected from any ill-intentioned gazes or improper behavior. The palla, which varied according to changing climate conditions, was generally made of wool for cold winter days and of cotton or silk for hot summer days. Roman women would choose the color of their palla to either contrast with or complement their other clothes. Although the palla was used in a wide variety of forms, it was most often designed to completely cover the head and body. Underwear. While men generally preferred not to wear underwear, depictions in mosaics show that they wore tight underwear similar to today's athletic briefs. The only clothing for workers and slaves while working could be their underwear. However, it is difficult to say that Roman men preferred wearing underwear as a daily habit. As for women, various mosaics show them wearing a breastband and briefs. While street dancers preferred to be naked, women wore tight breastbands similar to hairbands. A brief made of white, folded cloth or of materials like leather and linen in various colors was both a protection during menstruation and one of the displays of noble women. Indeed, since women in those years wanted to have slender body figures, they preferred tighter underwear. Other than these, it is not really possible to speak of underwear in Rome. Hygiene in Rome. It would not be wrong to say that there are significant differences in the approach to hygiene between the people of 2,000, 2,500 years ago and modern humans. The Roman people, who had access to water in every aspect of their lives, had the chance to meet their cleaning needs thanks to the aqueducts that brought water to the city. There were 1,300 fountains in the city and 200 public toilets called latrinae, and the people carried water to their homes in buckets. The system was also accompanied by a complex sewage network. While water was delivered to public areas like baths through lead pipes, it had to be carried in buckets for other places, unless, of course, you were from the upper class of Rome, because there were also water systems in palaces and some of the large houses. The public toilets were one of the places where the Roman people socialized. It cannot be said that the Romans were shy about using the toilet. In a large room, side by side and opposite each other, people would both chat and relieve themselves on perforated marble seats set over a channel through which water flowed. While the flowing water below served as a flush, an anal cleaning was performed by attaching a sponge, which Romans always carried with them, to a stick. These sticks were used communally by everyone. The sponges, however, were personal and kept in a cloth in one's pocket. After this process, the sponge was cleaned with water flowing from a small channel in the front. Often, this cleaning was not done at all. You are now seeing a Roman toilet on the screen. In ancient cities like Ephesus, Roman toilets, preserved almost as they were on the first day, still stand. Although Romans who had private toilets in their homes were not often found in these public spaces, it is known that some high-ranking Roman bureaucrats went to these toilets to gauge the public's mood or for certain political activities, and participated in toilet conversations. In other words, the toilets were a great social network. They were very good places to hear the daily gossip, meet a friend to talk, or simply discuss business. And, of course, urine was too valuable to be wasted. While today we unhesitatingly flush water over our urine or dispose of it, in ancient times urine was regarded as a valuable commodity. Urine contained a wide variety of minerals and chemicals such as potassium and phosphorus. The Romans believed that urine whitened teeth and protected them from decay. Therefore, they used urine as a mouthwash and mixed it with pumice stone to make toothpaste. According to the Romans, the best, and therefore the most expensive urine on the market came from Portugal. This urine was claimed to be the strongest in the world and therefore was preferred for whitening teeth. Even though most people today would reject a urine-based toothpaste, urine actually worked. This is because urine contains ammonia, a substance found in many cleaning products today. If you leave urine in an open container, it will start to decompose and subsequently produce ammonia upon contact with the air. Furthermore, urine was also used for laundry in the Roman period.
Thanks to its ammonia content, urine was also important in the textile industry, which developed throughout the history of the Roman state. In fact, urine was frequently used to whiten wool and clothes, and to tan leather. It was bought by the public in barrels, kept at home or in the garden for those who had the chance, and clothes were cleaned this way. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Emperor Nero introduced a new tax known as the vectigal urinae, which in Latin means urine tax. This tax functionally taxed the urine collected from public areas. This was because the lower classes disposed of their waste into the sewers by means of small pots. In addition, urine was also collected from public toilets. The person who collected the urine paid a tax in return. Then the urine was collected from the sewer, and after a series of chemical processes, it was turned into a valuable raw material. In this context, don't imagine that everywhere smelled of urine and that clothes came out of the wash bright yellow, because urine was the raw material for cleaning products and was made usable through various processes. However, we can say that there was a general sewage smell in the city due to urine conversion facilities, public toilets, and people emptying their household toilets in various places. So much so that according to the law, urine collected in pots had to be emptied into the sewer. But Romans who did not want to walk all the way to the sewer often emptied their urine pots even at their doorsteps. In fact, those living on the upper floors of the insulae would even pour their toilet pots out of the window. Although laws were passed from time to time to prevent this situation, the residents of the insulae, who sometimes had to climb 200 steps to reach their homes, never gave up pouring their toilet pots outside. However, it should be noted that the Romans were the most fond of bathing in the world of their time. This is clear and unequivocal, and the bath architecture they developed is still in use today. Those who started their work at sunrise would finish their jobs around noon and head straight for the bathhouse. It was now time for entertainment and relaxation. It had a low fee and it was free for children. The cleaning of the baths and the readiness of their water were announced to the public by the ringing of a bell on the roofs. Although the baths were generally used during the day, it is known that they were also opened and used at night in some cases. However, this was not a very common practice because nighttime use created problems, especially in terms of lighting costs and security. The Roman bath was designed for washing and relaxation, and it was a common feature of cities throughout the Roman state. The baths contained a wide variety of rooms with different temperatures, as well as swimming pools and sections for reading books, relaxing, and socializing. With their large indoor spaces, Roman baths were important driving forces in architectural innovations, especially in the use of the dome. The baths were built using non-combustible baked earth bricks, and the finished buildings were often adorned with fine mosaic floors, marble-clad walls, and decorative statues, making them magnificent works of art. Common features of Roman baths included changing rooms, exercise rooms, outdoor swimming pools, superheated dry and wet sweat rooms, a heated and hot water pool, heated rooms with a warm pool, and cool rooms with an unheated cold bath, often of monumental size and domed, which were the heart of the baths. There were also rooms for massage and other health treatments. Additional structures such as cold water plunge pools, private baths, libraries, conference halls, and open gardens were also included. For the Romans, these baths were an important part of daily life.
They were visited every day, and several hours were spent there. Wealthy Romans would also bring slaves with them to serve them. The slaves brought along would usually undertake the task of carrying towels and drinks. There were also attendants on hand for massage services and skin care. All Romans had access to these services, and the fees were kept very low. The Romans, relieved of the day's stress as mothers, fathers, and children, were more than ready to spend the day at the bath. Before bathing in Roman baths, sports were practiced. Running, weightlifting, and wrestling can be given as examples. After the workouts, servants would anoint their masters with oil, and then the oil would be scraped off with a piece of wood or bone. In this way, they were cleansed of major dirt. Body cleaning in the Roman bath was done with a tool called a strigalis. With this tool, sweat, sand, and dust adhering to the body were removed, and subsequently, the body was oiled in an area called the apoditerium. For spa-style hot water pools, the term thermae, or the Greek term thermos, was used. In the ruins in Pompeii, it has been seen that most of the public baths had separate sections for men and for women. Some baths were heated by a furnace underneath, while in others, water heated in a separate area was conveyed to the pool through pipes. Inside the pools of the baths, there were also raised sections that only the upper class could use, and these were called exedrae. Apart from these, wealthy Romans also had large-sized baths in their homes or palaces, and sometimes naked parties were held in these baths. The Romans, who had unlimited initiative over their slaves, could organize parties in their own baths with either prostitutes or their slaves. You can easily imagine this scene in your mind. A wealthy Roman is having a sex party in his private bath, while on one hand, musicians play instruments like the harp or horn, and on the other hand, slaves carrying trays of fruit, wine, and food are always ready, their eyes on their masters, waiting to carry out the next command. And of course, don't forget the male or female slaves providing sexual services during this time. You can be sure that this scene was very common in the private baths of the Roman wealthy. In the following sections, as we discuss sexual life in Rome, we will see the extravagances in more detail. Food in Rome. The food culture of the Romans, as in modern life and in human nature, starts with breakfast in the early hours of the morning. The first thing urban Romans did after waking up before sunrise was to have breakfast. The poor would prepare to go to their jobs, on one hand, and on the other, they would have a quick breakfast consisting of bread, water, wine, olives, and perhaps cheese. The poor people did not have the diverse wealth to set a table for breakfast. Therefore, it was considered a snack, and sometimes only bread was eaten. The wealthy, however, sat down to a rich breakfast of meat,
fish, vegetables, fruit, honey, and bread. And in those years, sugar was not yet known. We need to remember that the Roman state was centered in Italy, but had spread throughout the Mediterranean to Europe and to certain parts of Africa. Of course, as a Mediterranean civilization, one of its staple foods is olive oil and the other is wine. We know that both were produced and traded extensively, and the country's granary was Egypt. Indeed, during the struggle of Marcus Antonius, who went to Egypt, married Cleopatra, and tried to seize control against Rome, grain imports from Egypt to Rome were cut off. The people were forced to eat cats, dogs, and mice, and even cannibalism was seen.
However, the tomato, which holds an important place in the Mediterranean cuisine of today, was unknown at that time. Most fruits and vegetables were either non-existent or not popular. Fruits like grapes, figs, apples, and pears were consumed in abundance by the Romans. Milk, cheese, eggs, fish, and pork, along with legumes, also had an important place in Roman food culture. Chard, artichoke beet greens, and asparagus were very popular vegetables, and we see them featured extensively in surviving Roman recipes. The book titled De Re Coquinaria, meaning On the Subject of Cooking, which can be considered perhaps the first cookbook in history, is one of the important sources that describes Roman cuisine and has survived to the present day. Written by the Roman gourmet Apicius, the book provides detailed information on recipes and quality ingredients. From Apicius's accounts, we understand that the Romans did not prefer beef, mutton, and goat for meat purposes, because they used them for farm work and for their milk, and instead used pork, chicken, and various birds in their meat dishes. Although fish, sea urchins, mussels, oysters, and octopus were favorite foods of the Romans, not everyone had access to fish and seafood because they were difficult to catch. The sauce, known in ancient sources as garum or liquamen, was used instead of salt by both the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Garum, produced from fermented fish, was a part of every Roman's kitchen, rich or poor, and was very popular. The Romans, just like the Greeks, drank wine diluted with seawater. However, before meals, mead was also served as an appetizer. Bread was one of the indispensable foods of Roman cuisine, and there were many bakeries in Rome. Of course, these were very different from today's white bread. They were sour-leavened flatbreads made from whole grains. Honey was used to sweeten both desserts and dishes. Herbs with aroma like rosemary, coriander, and anise, and fragrant spices like cumin, cinnamon, and cloves were known and used, but black pepper had a special place. Since poor Romans did not have kitchens in their homes and usually tried to meet all their needs on the grill inside their room, and also because protective elements like refrigerators had not yet been invented, they generally consumed fast food type foods sold at small street stalls called taverne. These were the lowest ranking Romans and generally constituted the working class. In the menus of wealthy Romans, we also see animal and bird species like antelope and pelican brought from distant regions. The most important event of the evening is the dinner, called cena in Latin. In Roman villas, there is a room characteristically set aside for dinner. The Romans called this room the triclinium. In Latin literature, triclinium is used to mean 3 couches. We described this couch-like reclining furniture at the beginning, and dinner was consumed on these couches either by sitting uncomfortably or more comfortably by reclining, and the dinner had 3 stages. These are the gustatio, meaning the appetizers. This stage was able to be read thanks to the survival of the menu from a dinner party given by a wealthy Roman in his house. Just the appetizer section alone covers more than a full meal for most modern people. This appetizer course, called the gustatio, is a preparation for the meal, and the following were recorded: mulsum, which is a type of mead; herbed garlic cheese; chilbeur, which is a Turkish egg dish; boiled mushrooms; fresh cabbage and Brussels sprout salad, various sausages and links, cured fish, snails, olives, and bread. These were served for the wealthy Romans to pass the time while waiting for the meal, and believe me, they were presented with great abundance. The second stage, the main course: veal stew, various roasts of poultry, boiled ostrich, fried squid, fried fish, and sea bream. In the third stage, there were egg pudding, omelette soufflé, figs, apples, apricots, cherries, dates, pistachios, almonds, walnuts, Falernian wine, and a dessert similar to today's pudding. In addition, perfumes that would change the atmosphere of the room were sprinkled around. The heads and feet of the guests were adorned with wreaths made of flowers, and the guests would choose a king of the feast or master of ceremonies from among themselves. The chosen person would determine the ratio of wine to water, how much to drink, and how it would be drunk throughout the wine feast. It was generally drunk in turns, and many rounds were made. The most important of these was when a person raised their glass with wishes of "Prapino tibi bene vivas," meaning, "I drink to your good health and long life," and then finished the wine in one gulp. While the meals were being eaten, theaters, gladiator shows, music performances, and dancing girls added entertainment to the atmosphere. Although rare, we also know that pornography shows were performed by slaves. Depending on the wealth of the host, the presentation and activities could vary. For example, a cake or pastry would be brought for the most important guest to cut, and as the cake was cut, sparrows inside would fly out and scatter in all directions. This was done as one of the surprises of the night to entertain the guests. After the birds were freed, the cake would be taken back to the kitchen to be cooked better. We know from kitchen records that a wealthy Roman had 18 pigs cooked at the same time. In fact, each of the pigs was cooked for a different duration and at a different temperature according to taste, and this was done for a table of only 6 people. So much was eaten at these tables that there were jars for vomiting and then continuing to eat. There was no special vomiting jar. However, slaves who knew their masters knew what they would need, so they would have a container like a chamber pot ready to keep up with the master who wanted to vomit. Since it would be too much trouble to go to the toilet, a Roman would go to the other side of the room during conversation, urinate into the pot, and then continue eating. Sometimes a part of the room would be separated by a curtain for a toilet. For washing hands, containers filled with water were passed around by slaves, and everyone would comfortably wash their hands in the same water. If the household was large, there were several cooks, each specializing in a different culinary art. This is similar to the work of chefs in modern restaurants who have gained skills in different branches of the kitchen, like appetizer menus and pastries. In addition to waiters, there was even a trained carver, a scissor, who prepared the food in pieces suitable for eating with a spoon or fingers. The carver would perform this action in front of the guests as if presenting a grand show. No matter how ornate and elegant the meals were, the kitchens were very simple places. It is difficult to see anything other than a large counter and grills. Everything is very practical. Pots, pans, and ladles would be hanging on the walls. Everything had its place. This is generally how the guest-filled and talkative evening meals of the wealthy Romans went. The most important food businesses in the city were undoubtedly the bakeries. The bakeries, which were affiliated with guilds, were very large-scale because they had to feed a city population of up to 1 million, and bread was the staple food of the Romans. From time to time at events in the Agora, the bakeries would advertise, and with the free bread distributed at festivals, the bakers would try to direct customers to themselves. If you had a big bakery, you were probably among the wealthy of the city.
Entertainment. Life in Rome. The Romans were people who loved entertainment. We can say that despite all the hardships of the ancient world, they were not unhappy people. Every period had a festival, games, shows, and various entertainment elements that were carried out both as activities organized by the Roman administration to please the people and through the individual efforts of various organizations. In the entertainment world of the Romans, besides religious festivals, there were also parties in taverns and theaters. Of course, the shows that the public awaited with the greatest excitement were the gladiator games. Slaves or free Romans who wanted to earn money could join gladiator teams. These games did not always end in death. They were more in the nature of sword and shield demonstrations. Indeed, human life was valuable then too, and if someone were to die in every show, no one would be able to make money from this business. The Colosseum, completed in 80 AD, created a revolution for fights. Because the arena was built using tremendous engineering with pipe and insulation systems that could be filled with water, even naval battle shows called naumachia could be reenacted. The great Colosseum battles were generally staged in the form of reenacting major events in Roman history. Hannibal the Carthaginian, the Gauls, and the conquest of Britain were the most frequently reenacted historical events, and each time they ended with the victory of the Romans. After the naval battles were over, the water in the arena would be drained back into reservoirs through channels. Female gladiators were also found among the gladiators. Although not very common, records of 20 to 30 female gladiators have been found. During the imperial period, the Senate by law could not provide financial support for more than 2 gladiator shows per year, but there was no limit to the gladiator shows that the emperor could hold. Despite this, gladiator games remained rare and extraordinary events. For example, Emperor Augustus held gladiator shows only 8 times during his reign of over 60 years. There was a steady increase both in the number of game days held in Rome and in the regularly planned gladiator games in the later periods of the process. By the year 354 AD, games were held for 6 months of the year, with 102 days for theatrical entertainments, 64 for horse races, and 10 days for gladiator shows and beast hunts. For example, in addition to chariot races and gladiator fights, which can be shown as the most popular of the games, various other types of games and sports such as wild animal fights, running races, boxing, wrestling, various athletic competitions, and the Troy game were also held. Those sentenced to death were also brought out into the arena before wild animals or other gladiators, and their executions were carried out in this way. Although it is thought that the Romans held their chariot races, wrestling, and boxing competitions inspired by the Etruscans, it can be said that the gladiator games were invented by the Romans themselves. Greek sports had a great influence on the organization of athletics and running races. However, an important point to be noted on this subject is that the Romans were largely uninterested in Greek sports such as athletics and running races, and these sports were not popular with the public, especially during the Republican period and the early years of the imperial period. In this regard, Suetonius stated that Emperor Augustus did not attend Greek games or races and did not properly reward the winners of the competitions. The reason for this situation among the Romans is primarily shown to be the element of nudity contained in Greek sports. Gutmann explains this situation quite simply with the statement, "The sight of a naked runner seemed ridiculous to them." Emperor Augustus, also known as Octavius, is considered the first emperor of Rome and is the nephew of Julius Caesar, who at one time suppressed the Roman Senate and declared his official dictatorship. Emperor Augustus, described as being as cold as an iceberg and as serious as Aristotle, was also known for his conservatism, took a stand against nudity, banned prostitution for a period, and made it mandatory for women to marry and have children. Interestingly, in studies conducted on the bodies of gladiators from Ephesus, which date back to the period when the city was under Roman rule, their diet was found to be vegetarian.
Drinks made from a mixture of barley and a type of vegetable greatly changed what we knew until today about the diets of the Ephesian gladiators. While they were expected to be fed a more protein-based diet for their wounds to heal faster, the discovery that they were fed a vegetable and grain-based diet instead moves the Ephesian gladiators to an important place in medical history. Another important part of the entertainment life in Rome was the special rooms in the houses of wealthy Romans made for men to hold banquets with their friends. The custom of eating, which was considered luxurious and ostentatious from the 6th century BC onwards, was adopted from the East, from Lydia or Persia. Only the man of the house and his guests could attend these types of meals. While they ate separately, the woman of the house and the children gathered around the hearth. Although the banquet initially emerged with religious justifications, feasts given after wars or hunts, or the custom of warriors eating together, it descended to the common people along with men's meeting places in the 5th century BC and beyond, becoming more than a luxury, a habit. The venues, seen in vase depictions from the 7th century BC, are found not in every house, but in the homes of rulers and aristocrats. The most important furniture of these venues was the klein, a couch-like reclining seat made of stone, wood, or bronze. In small spaces, there were at least 3 kleins. The 3-legged table, either square or round, used during dinner, was also an indispensable item of these venues, just like the klein. The table was easy to carry due to its 3 legs, was brought in with the food on it during the meal, and could be pushed under the klein when the meal was finished. In some depictions, we also see a footstool used as a step to get onto the klein, and on which shoes were placed when reclining on the klein. Vitruvius describes these rooms called andron as follows: "In large rooms that can easily accommodate 4 kleins, with enough space for serving and entertainment, according to traditions, it is not customary for the hostess to be present at such banquets. Since men live in these spaces without being disturbed by women, its name is andron." Taverns are also important entertainment venues. The customers, who were generally male, gathered in taverns and predominantly drank wine and beer, watched the performances of singers and female dancers, gambled using stones or dice, and probably ended the night with prostitutes. While women generally entertained themselves at family parties, places like taverns were presented for the service of men. In Rome, since every month of the year and some days of the week were dedicated to the gods, religious festivals could be seen at any time. At these festivals, street artists, theater actors, pantomimes, and singers would perform, and since the shows were financed by a wealthy Roman, they would be open to the public free of charge.
Slaves and prostitutes, however, could not participate in religious festivals. The festival dates, the sponsors of the festival, and who could not attend were announced by an official in the forum. Fast food sellers, confectioners, and vendors who placed small toys for children on their stalls added color to the festivals. The games and sports shows, which can be said to have a very important position in the social and political life of Rome, were held during the kingdom period mainly for religious purposes, such as honoring the gods, with more pagan origins, whereas from the Republican period onwards, they began to be held for various purposes, such as preventing the broad sections of society from creating unrest and making political demands, celebrating great military successes, and gaining the support of the people. For example, according to a legend of the Romans, shows called Equirria were held to honor the war god Mars, who was thought to be the father of Romulus, the founder and first king of Rome. Races were organized in the name of the god Jupiter. The Floralia Games were held in the name of the goddess Flora. The Megalacia Games were held in honor of the goddess Cybele, and the Ceres Festival was held in honor of the goddess Ceres, along with many other games and shows held in the name of various gods.
Juvenal, in his work Satires, expresses quite successfully how the Roman state smoothed over the political demands and unrest of the people. For a long time now, we have not been able to sell our vote to anyone. Our people cast off their anxieties long ago, because the people who once gave powers, axes, and legions and everything have now limited themselves and have come to greedily desire only two things: bread and circuses. Education in Rome. In ancient Rome, education was informal and familial in the early Republic, but progressed towards a system-based education in the late Republic and imperial periods. The Roman education system was based on the Greek education system, and most of the private tutors in the Roman education system were Greek slaves or freedmen. The educational curriculum used in Rome was copied in all the provinces of Rome, and later formed the basis for the Western civilization's education systems. Until the 2nd century AD, organized education was applied relatively rarely, and we have only a few pieces of information about the Roman education process applied up to that time. Due to the extensive power the paterfamilias had over Roman families, the level and quality of education provided to Roman children varied greatly from family to family. Nevertheless, Roman culture later developed in such a way that fathers were expected to educate their children to some degree. A full and high-level education was expected of any Roman who wanted to enter politics. In the peak period of the Roman University and later the Roman Empire, the Roman education system slowly took its final form. Official schools that gave students allowances were established. However, very few educational institutions that provided free public education. Both boys and girls were educated, although not necessarily together, in a manner very similar to the system prevailing in the modern world. The Roman education system developed schools that were organized in tiers. Quintilian, one of the Roman educators, acknowledged the importance of starting education as early as possible, and stated that while memory exists in everyone, not just young children, the information learned at that age is particularly lasting. A Roman student progressed through schools similar to how a student today prepares for middle school from elementary school, and then for university.
On the Nundane days, which were a type of weekend every 8 days, they were generally exempt from education. Promotion to the next grade was based more on ability than on age. Great importance was attached to a student's ingenium, their innate gift for learning, in short, their intelligence, and also to the student's ability to receive a higher level of education. At the foundation of ancient Roman education, first and foremost, were the home and family, where children received their so-called moral education. While Greek boys primarily received their education in public, the first and most important educators of a Roman child were almost always their parents. In the early Republican period, parents taught their children the agricultural, domestic, and military skills necessary for life, as well as skills that included the moral and civil responsibilities expected of them as citizens. Roman education was conducted almost exclusively at home, under the management of the paterfamilias. Children receiving education would learn enough reading, writing, and arithmetic from their parents, or the highest-ranking male of the family, to understand simple commercial transactions and to count, weigh, and measure. Men like Senator Cato, a famous defender of the Republic, adhered to this Roman tradition and took their teaching roles very seriously. The elder Cato not only raised his children to be diligent, good citizens and responsible Romans, but he was also his son's reading teacher, law professor, and athletic coach. He taught his son not only how to throw a javelin, fight in armor, and ride a horse, but also boxing,
enduring both heat and cold and swimming well. Vocational training was also given importance. Boys gained valuable experience through apprenticeships. However, the roles of mothers as moral educators and character developers for their children certainly cannot be ignored. In fact, Cornelia Africana, the mother of the Gracchi, is seen as the most important factor in the development of her son's famous good speaking and oratory skills. As the Roman Republic transitioned to a more systematic education, parents began to hire private tutors for this advanced academic training. The Romans started bringing Greek slaves to Rome to further enrich their children's knowledge and potential. However, the Romans always preserved the tradition of pietas and the concept of the father being the child's teacher, the ludus, or elementary school. During the Republican or imperial periods, Rome never officially established a state-supported form of primary education. At no stage in Roman history did it legally require the public to be educated to any level. It was typical for the children of wealthy Roman families to receive their initial education from private tutors. However, it was also common for children with more modest means to be educated in a type of elementary school traditionally known as the ludus literarius. The instructor in such a school was generally known as a literator or literatus, which was considered a quite respectable title. Other than their low salaries, there was nothing to prevent a literator from establishing their own school. There was never a designated established location for a ludus. They could be found in various places, from a private residence to a gymnasium, and even on the street. Typically, primary education in ancient Rome focused on the needs of daily life, reading and writing.
Students progressed from reading and writing letters to syllables, then learning words, and finally to memorizing and reciting texts. The texts used in early Roman education were mostly literary texts. These texts were predominantly poetry. Greek poets like Homer and Hesiod were often used as lesson examples due to the lack of Roman literature. Roman students were expected to work on their own. Since students came and went at different times throughout the day, there was no sense of a class unit as a cohesive whole. Young Roman students never faced an exam or a written test. Their level of achievement was measured by the exercises in which they were corrected or praised based on their performance. This created an inevitable sense of competition among the students. The Romans, by using a competitive education system, developed a form of social control that allowed the elites to maintain the continuity of their classes. This competitive system required a large amount of money to be spent for a good education, which prevented the majority of non-wealthy Roman students from advancing to higher levels of education. The Grammaticus. Between the ages of 9 and 12, the male children of wealthy families would leave the education they were receiving from the literator. They would then begin to work with a grammaticus, who developed the students' writing and speaking skills, mastered the art of literary analysis, and taught them this rich heritage. They did not yet know Greek. The grammatici continued to use the poems and poets that the students had seen in their previous education at the ludus in their poetry analysis classes. At this point, while rich boys were educated by private tutors, boys from the lower classes who had finished the ludus would already be working as apprentices, and girls, whether rich or poor, would focus on finding a husband and then having children as soon as possible. The daily activities that included lessons given by the grammaticus involved the meaningful reading of poetry and poetry analysis. The curriculum was completely bilingual, as students were expected to read and speak both Greek and Latin. The evaluation of a student's performance was done instantly and on the spot, according to the standards set by their own grammaticus. Students would complete an exercise, show the results to their instructor, and the grammaticus, who saw himself as the guardian of the language, would correct any deficiencies as needed or praise them.
Among the famous linguists were Lucius Orbilius Pupillus, who did not hesitate to beat or whip his students to drive the lesson home, and the freed slave Marcus Varius Flaccus, who, due to imperial patronage, gained widespread guardianship and pitted students of similar age and ability against each other in rhetoric competitions, often rewarding the winner with a rare old book, a novel practice he was known for. Varius Flaccus, who was hired by Augustus to teach his grandsons and demanded enormous fees due to his great prestige in Rome, never had his own classroom, even at the peak of his career. Instead, like many of his fellow teachers, he used spaces in schools that could be privately rented for usually very low fees, and he rented classroom space wherever he could find it. Other teachers saved on rent and lighting costs by holding their classes on sidewalks, in porticos, or in other public areas where traffic noise and bad weather were sure to be a problem. Although both literary and documentary sources provide different information on the various titles used for a teacher, and often use the most general terms to describe all teachers, a price edict published by Diocletian in 301 AD showed that such distinctions really existed, and that a teacher had to define himself, at least in theory, as a literator, grammaticus, or rhetor.
This edict on maximum wages fixed the salary of a grammaticus at 200 denarii per month per student. However, this edict could not be enforced. It was ignored and eventually repealed. Children continued to work with the grammaticus until they were 14 or 15 years old. At this point, only the wealthy and most promising students had the chance to receive a rhetorical education. The rhetor was the final stage in Roman education. Very few men could continue to study rhetoric. In the early history of Rome, this was the only way to serve as a lawyer or politician. In the early Roman period, rhetorical studies were not only taught through a teacher. Rhetorical education was also given through a student's careful observation of their elders. Before the practice of rhetoric became an institution in Roman society, it was practiced by the Greeks, and it took a long time for the practice to be accepted in Rome. The orator or rhetoric student was important in Roman society because of the continuous political strife that occurred throughout Roman history. Young men who received rhetorical education did not just focus on public speaking. These students also studied other subjects such as geography, music, philosophy, literature, mythology, and geometry. These versatile studies provided Roman orators with a more diverse education and helped prepare them for future debates. There were two fields of rhetorical study available to young men. The first of these fields was the deliberative branch of study. This field was for the education of young men who would later need to put forward their opinions on the advisability or inadvisability of measures affecting the Roman Senate. The second field of study was much more lucrative and was known as forensic oratory. These orators would later enter important fields in winning over public opinion, such as in criminal law. The support of the public was very important for a successful political career in Rome. A final level of education was philosophy education. Philosophy education is clearly Greek. However, it was undertaken by many Roman students. To study philosophy, a student usually had to go abroad to a philosophy center in Greece, where philosophers taught. The education of a philosophical school of thought could add a lot to Cicero's praised great knowledge. However, this education could only be seen by the wealthiest elites of Rome. The Romans saw philosophical education as distinctly a Greek affair, and instead focused on establishing schools of law and rhetoric in their education.